The Precious Metals Week in Review, November 20th, 2015. Brought to you by Precious Metals International. The Federal Reserve continues to be the main driving factor for stock market moves in the U.S. as speculation ramps over the likelihood of an interest rate hike in December. Fed members continue to send out mixed messages over the likelihood of a rate hike when speaking publicly. The number of Americans filing new claims for unemployment benefits fell by 5,000 claims last week to a new level of 271,000. The previous week's data remained unrevised. We are now entering the usual period of seasonal hiring, so weekly unemployment data may be unreliable for quite some time due to a surge in temporary hiring for the expected holiday shopping rush. Last week's terror attacks in Beirut and Paris in particular shocked the world. In France, the death toll from the attacks that were carried out last Friday has now reached 130. French police have been conducting massive manhunts this week in an attempt to locate additional individuals involved in the attacks, as well as to ferret out other groups who might be planning similar actions throughout France. On Friday, terrorists also seized hostages at a resort in Mali, a former colony of France. The attackers were apparently quickly subdued. The majority of the hostages apparently escaped, but officials have not released the complete information on the incident as yet, so we do not have information on whether any hostages were killed or injured in the incident. The Islamic State, commonly called ISIS or ISIL, has claimed responsibility for most of the terror incidents that have taken place around the world in the last few weeks. Following the attacks last Friday in France, airstrikes on Islamic State positions in Syria and Iraq have been stepped up dramatically. France, Russia, and the United States have all conducted airstrikes on known ISIS positions. China, who has remained out of the conflict with ISIS in Syria thus far, now also has reason to engage. On Thursday, China vowed that it would bring to justice those responsible for the execution of one of its citizens. ISIS said it had killed a Chinese national in addition to a Norwegian that the group had taken hostage in recent months. China's foreign ministry said, "The Chinese government strongly condemns this savage attack devoid of humanity and will certainly bring the criminals to justice. The Chinese government will resolutely oppose all forms of terrorism and resolutely strike at any violent terrorist criminal activities that defy the bottom lines of human culture. China will continue to strengthen anti-terrorism cooperation with the international community to maintain peace and tranquility in the world." In China, the People's Bank of China announced another round of stimulus on Thursday, lowering the interest rates on the loans that the PBOC provides to other banks. The new measures became effective on Friday and cut the rate on its loans to other lenders by 2.75% for overnight loans and 3.25% for 7-day loans. The move to ease further comes as business sentiment in China continues to worsen. A survey conducted by MNI Indicators showed business indicators falling to 49.9 from 55.5 in October. Much as with other economic indexes, a reading below 50 indicates contraction, showing that demand within the Chinese economy continues to decline. Elsewhere in Asia, exports in Japan fell for the first time in over a year for the month of October. Exports dipped 2.1%, while imports fell 13.4% in October, and both figures may indicate renewed weakness in the Japanese economy that appears to be driven largely by China's slowing demand. Japan's economy officially entered recession again, according to data released on Monday, and analysts now widely expect that the Bank of Japan will be forced to introduce even more monetary stimulus to offset the economic impact that China's slowing economy continues to have on Japan. In Finland, a petition has circulated and apparently gained 50,000 signatures, which will force the Finnish parliament to debate on whether Finland should remain in the Eurozone. Finland is just the latest member of the 19-member country bloc to express growing dissatisfaction as its economy has continued to contract. It is important to note that the Eurozone, the 19-member bloc of countries that all use the euro as their currency, is distinctly different from the European Union, which is a broader 28-country bloc dedicated to facilitating better trade and closer economic ties. Not all members of the EU use the euro as their currency, with the United Kingdom being the prime example. Finland joins a growing list of countries seemingly dissatisfied with membership in the Eurozone, if not the European Union itself. Friday morning, European Central Bank President Mario Draghi gave a speech at the Frankfurt European Banking Congress where he discussed the upcoming meeting of the ECB's Governing Council. Mr. Draghi said, "At the December Governing Council meeting, we will thoroughly assess the strength and persistence of the factors that are slowing the return of inflation towards 2%. If we conclude that the balance of risk to our medium-term price stability objective is skewed to the downside, we will act by using all the instruments available within our mandate. We consider the asset purchase program to be a powerful and flexible instrument, as it can be adjusted in terms of size, composition, or duration to achieve a more expansionary stance. If we decide that the current trajectory of our policy is not sufficient to achieve our objective, we will do what we must to raise inflation as quickly as possible." Crude oil prices remain suppressed this week, hovering around the $40 a barrel range as continued excess global supply moves to drive prices still lower. Winter is also expected to be milder than usual this year, and that too will likely factor into the glut of oil across the globe as drawdowns of supply prove weaker than usual this year. The euro took a wild ride this week, moving lower against the US dollar in a series of jagged drops and spikes. By Wednesday, the battered currency had found a floor and started moving higher, nearing its starting point for the week late on Thursday. The euro saw another decline as it moved into Friday and will close the week lower against the US dollar as a result. The Japanese yen spiked higher at the opening for the week, but the move was short-lived and the yen began moving lower against the dollar through Wednesday. The yen too found a floor on Wednesday and began climbing back up through the rest of the week. By Friday, the yen's advance had halted and it will close the week slightly lower against the US dollar. Last week's terror attacks and the follow-on events that occurred this week have opened the world's eyes to the growing reach of radicalized terror groups. The events could have far-reaching effects, particularly on the European Union, as anti-immigration backlash reaches new heights. The European Union has long prided itself on the ease of moving goods and services across the borders of its member countries. The massive flood of immigrants that has been triggered by the civil war in Syria and the rise of the Islamic State now threatens to call that ease of transit into question. The fact that some of the terrorists responsible for last week's attacks clearly came into Europe amidst groups of Syrian refugees has forced the citizens of the EU to question the wisdom of allowing even more refugees to flow into Europe from the war-torn country. Even in the United States, the House of Representatives passed a bill on Thursday calling for the suspension of a recent program that would admit some of the Syrian refugees into the U.S., amid fears that radicalized terrorists might take advantage of the program. Newly appointed House Speaker Paul Ryan called the legislation an urgent matter and said that we must remember that our first priority is to protect the American people. The new legislation would require the FBI to conduct background checks on both Syrian and Iraqi refugees and would require the heads of both the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security to certify to Congress that every refugee screened is not a threat to the security of the United States. The move by Congress comes just one day after Honduran authorities said Wednesday that they had intercepted 6 Syrian nationals traveling under falsified Greek passports within the last week, 5 of whom were trying to reach the United States. On Tuesday, a soccer match between Germany and the Netherlands was canceled due to threat of an attack at the stadium in Hanover, Germany. The Hanover police chief told reporters, "We had concrete evidence that someone wanted to set off an explosive device in the stadium." On Thursday, ratings agency Standard & Poor's released a report that noted a surge in terrorism, Islamist or otherwise, is by itself unlikely to affect the sovereign ratings of Western European economies. That said, terrorism could gradually and indirectly hamper economic growth prospects in the region and have potential fiscal consequences for governments. The report went on to discuss possible economic impacts to Europe, saying, with fears of further terrorist attacks on the rise, tourism could take a hit not only in Paris but possibly more broadly. Aviation and certain service industries may drag on economic growth as consumers retreat from what they consider exposed and crowded locations of commerce and leisure activities. The weak recovery in Europe could become weaker still and have negative implications for fiscal adjustment, employment, and social cohesion. In Asia, China's economy appears to be slowing further and is beginning to affect the economies of neighboring countries like Japan as demand for goods falls off. Given the global geopolitical and macroeconomic environment, central banks around the world, the one obvious exclusion being the Federal Reserve, appear to be preparing to unleash even more monetary easing. The Bank of Japan, European Central Bank, People's Bank of China, all appear set to ease further even as speculation grows that the U.S. Federal Reserve is preparing to tighten. In such an environment, the mainstream media continues to bash precious metals, piling on even more negative sentiment against them, using the possibility of the Fed tightening as the latest reason not to own them. In a commentary piece posted to CNBC this week, Peter Schiff, CEO of Euro-Pacific Capital, pointed out why such a mentality does not necessarily hold true. In a commentary piece titled, "Here's Why I'm Bullish on Gold," Mr. Schiff discusses gold's performance in a rising rate environment. Mr. Schiff notes that beginning in June of 2004, Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan kicked off a series of 17 rate hikes of 25 basis points that lasted 2 years. Mr. Schiff notes that during that 2-year period, gold rose almost continuously, rising 62%, from 390 to 630 by the time the Fed stopped tightening. So it's a myth that higher interest rates are automatically bearish for gold. Mr. Schiff's piece is well worth the time it takes to read it and can be seen by clicking on the article title above. In short, the global geopolitical and economic environment has become even more uncertain in the wake of last week's attacks and the additional terrorist-related events that transpired this week. In such an environment, wise investors have continued with their plans to accumulate physical precious metals as buying opportunities arise, allowing them to do so. To quote Mr. Schiff from the aforementioned article, the retreat of gold to the sub-$1,100 range is really an unexpected gift for those who may have missed out on the entry level 6 weeks ago. Next week will be a shortened trading week due to the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday. Despite the shortened week, there will be a large amount of economic data released, and all of it should be watched with interest. Keep an eye out for buying opportunities that allow for the acquisition of physical precious metals at a discount as part of a well-diversified portfolio in an uncertain world. Remember that precious metals should always be viewed as a long-term investment, and that the key to profitability through the ownership of physical precious metals is to actually acquire and own the physical products, and to hold them for the long term. Always remember that you should never overextend your ability to maintain ownership of your precious metals over the long term. The Precious Metals Week in Review, November 20th, 2015. Brought to you by Precious Metals International.